Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology and our discussion on gender and sexuality. Let's talk about sex in a global perspective. So, we oftentimes focus on the Western perspective, right? What is American sexuality? And that's because we live in it, right? This is our reality, this is our life. So, we have a tendency to focus on it. And this is the case for most of the Western world, right? We have a certain ideology. That ideology is usually, sort of stemming from a religious practice or a religious ideology that tells us how we should behave concerning sex and gender. Um, and this has been passed down to us through all of our norms and our values, um, even the terminology that we use, the symbols, the language, and the way that we are capable of understanding those, right? Our mental maps, right? How we categorize everything, right? We categorize this, we categorize that. How do we categorize sex? And oftentimes, we oftentimes sort of combine sex and gender into one word, right? It's kind of like race and ethnicity. Race is one thing, ethnicity is something completely different. In this case, sexuality is certainly the biological aspect, and how it's seen in culture, and then gender, the ideology around behavior of those sexes, they are two different things, right? Sex being the biology and gender being the cultural implications. But they do get mixed in together. And so I've seen a lot of people sort of interchangeably use those terms. And that is an incorrect way of talking about sexuality and talking about gender, because they are two different things that are related, right? But that is a part of our society, right? How we organize things, our, again, going back to our mental maps, what boxes do we put people in based on whatever traits they express, right? Fruits and vegetables, as an example. Like, how do we determine what's a fruit? How do we determine what's a vegetable? And how come tomatoes are a fruit but are treated like vegetables? Tomatoes are the trans vegetable fruit of the plant world, right? So let's talk about some different ways that we might see how this is expressed. So let's look at the Mati of Suriname. So the women that live in Suriname, the Mati people, they have different ideas about sexuality. Part of it is the fact that they are much more open to um, the ideas of sex being not a not something that should be done just in a one-on-one, or male-female, or marriage, or pair bonding. They look at sexual behavior in a very different way. So much so that we as social scientists don't really have a name for what they do, right? That we would sort of classify them um, as sort of like generally queer, um, in the fact that they practice some monogamy. Sometimes they practice um, homosexual relationships with each other. Sometimes, right? 75% of women engage in sexual behavior that differs from what we consider to be standard here in the Western world. That's a lot. We see that women are oftentimes avoiding the concept of marriage, so they don't get married, but they will seek relationships that are either mutually beneficial between themselves and their possible mates, or other women that might also be child rearing, um, or just interested in having mutually beneficial relationships that may include sexual relation or may not, right? They're dealing with a whole different realm of behavior that is sort of outside of our understanding of our capability of creating that mental map, right? That box, right? This is a box outside of all the other boxes. We don't have a label for it yet. A lot of these relationships are sexual in nature, and are oftentimes related to child rearing, but also have economic and spiritual benefits that go along with these types of relationships. They can be done um, through having either singular or multiple partners at a time. You might engage in a relationship with a man so that you can bear a child, and that father will have an impact on the family, but might not live there, right? May never have the obligation to live there. And culturally, right? Even in our society, we put a lot of emphasis on sort of the relationship of the father within the family. And here, there are different implications, different ways of looking at fatherhood and the role of that individual in child rearing. Um, so they might engage in different relationships simultaneously or consecutively, depending on the need of that individual. Um, and sometimes those relationships can be casual, they can be long term, but not necessarily, um, you know, deep relationships that we would consider, usually when picking a mate to have children with, right? Our ideology when it comes to child rearing is that we want to create a family. And what does that family look like? What does that kinship look like? In this case, kinship is definitely um, a much more, how we would look at it as like disorganized, but for them, very practical, right? And that's because that system has worked for them for many, many generations. And so let's talk a little bit about gender stratification, right? How do we look at different genders, um, and sort of the power structure that works within them? So, what makes one culture value one gender or another above one another, right? Why do we see that? Certainly in Western culture, we've seen sort of male children, um, and males in general having more power, more influence, more resources than women in general. Um, and then what are those stereotypes? How do we look at gender stereotypes? These are beliefs that men and women behave a certain way, um, and diverting from those stereotypes can have, certain consequences, sometimes severe. And again, that's kind of going back to, what happens if someone expresses more masculine traits. If you're a woman, but you are expressing, more masculine traits, especially when we think about masculine traits, being aggressive, right? Where does that put you in the overall scheme of things? And then as we look at gender ideology and cultural ideals, and we create this understanding, right? Again, an ideal about what is right, right? We justify this kind of behavior through creating ideals, creating an educational system, having that reinforced through religion and political ideology, um, and we then generally accept that as the norm, right? All of these things, you know, fit this ideology, but those ideologies are reinforced, but they are constructed by culture, right? We have things that are within our culture, and then everybody agrees upon them, and then that becomes the truth until people come along and say, well, that's not what I believe in, and we're going to change that. We're going to change that behavior. We're going to change this. And then all of a sudden, you've got a lot of people that don't fit that norm. right? They no longer fit that norm, and that's when culture changes. And that's what we're seeing right now, as we're seeing that the sort of ideologies that of the last 100 years has been challenged and is being changed by a modern public, right? Different ideologies. And we've touched on this before, the sort of idea of man the hunter and woman the gatherer. And for a long time it was believed that these were, again, masculine traits. They were hunters, they were protectors, and this still sort of fills our national dialogue, right, about the role of men and women in society. Um, However, historically, this does not have a lot of truth behind it. Okay. And that's just because we have studied cultures around the world that engage in practices that go back thousands and thousands of years. These nomadic communities that still exist today and have been existing the same way for the last 100,000 years. And as we study those cultures, we have found that a lot of the same roles and um, activities that these people engage in can be done by either men or women, right? It doesn't matter what that activity is. If it's hunting, then 70% of women are still going to engage in hunting. They're going to go out with everyone else, and they're going to hunt, and they're going to trap, and they're going to do all the same things that men do. And then gathering. Men are going to go out, and they're not going to not gather something that's right there in front of them because they're a hunter. No, because they're more concerned about eating, right, than having that sort of gendered ideology. So they're going to gather up the resources that they see as well and not always be so focused on hunting. So in a historical sense, this idea of man the hunter and woman the gatherer is an ideology that does not fit the actual history of the human species. This is a cultural ideology that we practiced for a long time. It was a reason that we could justify certain behavior, right? The aggressiveness of men and the supportiveness and possibly even meekness of women, that all they're capable of doing is gathering and not hunting. We know that's not the case, right? So again, a lot of these roles have been interchangeable, right? And I think it's important to kind of recognize some of this and sort of that ideology that goes in with this, right? I look at that sort of idea, that term like boys will be boys, and that has oftentimes been used as an excuse for the behavior of young men to go out and behave aggressively, either in a physical sense, in a sexual sense, in a lot of different ways, and that it is inherently natural that that is what they do. And that is not the case. That is definitely culturally taught, right? That they're just going out there and sowing their oats, or they're going out and getting in fights because their hormones are raging. No, that is cultural behavior, right? If you teach children that there's a certain type of behavior that is acceptable, then they will engage in that behavior, and they will take examples from your family, from television, from their community, and if that community shows, that this is what happens when young men go out there, um, then they will perpetuate that practice. So again, this is a culturally constructed behavior when it comes to the behavior of men and women. They are not just naturally aggressive and can go out and engage in that. Men or women can be like that. But boys will be boys is an excuse for bad behavior, right? That's important to take into account. So, what is heterosexuality and how did it come about? So even the term heterosexuality didn't really surface until the late 19th century. Um, and the concept behind it uh, developed out of the need to expand American ideology around sex, right? Because prior to that, we had a um, very strict sense, very biblical um, understanding of sex and how we should behave around it, right? The very puritanical expression of sexuality. But that wasn't what Americans were doing, right? They were taught in church and in school and government that this is the behavior of what you should be doing. But what they were actually doing in their bedrooms, that was a different story. And so we started coming up with this term of heterosexuality, and it expanded upon the actual behavior as a scientific reasoning behind the behavior of American adults and what they were doing, what they were practicing um, behind closed doors versus what they were expressing in the public, right? These are two different places in which sexuality is expressed. So if we think about that puritanical sense of sexuality, sex was for procreation only, right? You got married, you were supposed to be a virgin, right? You get married, you have sex, which hopefully that one or two times, boom, you have a kid, and then you stop, right? Because sex should only be about procreation, and you should have lots of kids. That was a good justification for having more sex, right? But you should have lots of kids, and there are cultural reasons why having lots of kids was a good thing, at least at the time, because uh, infant mortality was really high back in those days. There are a lot of families that they wouldn't name their kids, they wouldn't name their children until they were like 2 years old. Right? And that's an interesting thing. They wouldn't name their kids until they were two because they didn't know if those kids were going to survive. Right? It wasn't uncommon that families would have 6, 7, 8 kids, but there might have been 3 or 4 stillbirths, or there might have been miscarriages and stuff like that, or the kid would get sick and die before they got to the age of 2. So even naming practices um, were uh, were different back in the day because we didn't know if those kids would survive. So, but it also gave them a chance to, get down and, have kids. Um, sex was for sex was never for recreation or masturbation. Both of those were seen as aberrant behaviors um, and against the will of the church and of God. Right, so very puritanical sense, and it's still one of the reasons why there are um, different religions where priests are not allowed to have sex or nuns are not allowed to have sex is because it is against this sort of practice with their religion. Um, this was an interesting fact that has never left my brain since I learned it. Um, when it came to things like masturbation for men, it was oftentimes seen as a very dangerous activity, literally a lethal activity, because it was thought that for every ounce of semen that was generated, it would cost the body like 8 ounces of blood to transmorph that blood into semen, and if you did it too many times, you could literally die from blood loss, right? That was a fear that was common. And so engaging in any of those activities, you're literally taking your life into your hands, right? So you wouldn't want to do that. That was bad because you could die. Now we know biologically that that is not the case, right? I don't think I've ever heard of a case where somebody died from masturbation. Um, you know, sex, sure, somebody dies from a heart attack, yeah, that happens. Um, but that's not a normal practice, and so right, there's a biological reality, and then that cultural historical reality that was believed in. So the thing is that people were experimenting and they were trying these different things, and then they found out that these puritanical ideals didn't necessarily fit what again was going on in modern day America, right? And all of a sudden people started to rally around this idea of heterosexuality because it more or less reflected what America had evolved into when it came to sexual activity, right? And so we started seeing this sort of common ideology, and the American people rally behind um, heterosexuality because it was more open. It was more relaxed. It was more um, inclusive than what that puritanical ideology had been prior. Okay, shifting gears here. In fact, what we're going to do, we're going to pause um, and then come back to this topic. So we'll give you a break. All right, we'll catch you in a few minutes.